The night of the benefactors unfolded in Seattle, a city where money preferred silence and power favored locked doors. The waterfront was wrapped in fog that evening, the kind that softened edges and blurred distances, turning glass towers into muted silhouettes and streetlights into pale halos reflected on wet pavement. The historic hotel by the bay stood apart from the modern skyline, an artifact of old influence that had learned to survive by adapting rather than resisting. Its stone facade carried decades of discreet agreements, sealed envelopes, and conversations that never reached the public record. Tonight, its chandeliers were lit not for charity, but for leverage. The gala was announced as a fundraiser for urban renewal and cultural preservation, a carefully chosen narrative that sounded benevolent enough to justify seven-figure donations. Inside the ballroom, polished marble floors reflected the movement of tailored suits and evening gowns. Crystal glasses clinked softly, carrying the illusion of celebration, while the air itself felt dense with calculation. Every smile had been rehearsed, every laugh timed, every handshake weighted with unspoken conditions. On the stage, city representatives delivered speeches about community, safety, and shared futures. In the back rows, financiers, developers, and security executives evaluated zoning maps, protection contracts, and access to municipal boards. Among them stood Aiden Black, the youngest figure in the room who did not need to introduce himself. At 36, he was already considered an anomaly. As president of Blackridge Holdings, he had doubled the company's assets in less than 3 years, absorbing smaller competitors and forcing older unions to either align with him or disappear. His background in private security and infrastructure gave him an advantage most legacy players lacked. He understood both physical control and bureaucratic pressure. He did not raise his voice, did not perform dominance theatrically, and did not chase attention. His authority came from consistency and from the fact that when he made a move, it stayed made. Aiden observed the room with detached focus. He recognized patterns rather than faces, watching how people clustered, how often they checked their phones, who avoided whose gaze. The gala was not an event to him, but a live map of alliances and fractures. Every benefactor present had come to secure something, whether it was protection, silence, or a seat at a table that mattered. The charity was merely the entry fee. Security moved subtly along the walls, men and women trained to blend into the decor while maintaining sightlines and exits. Blackridge handled part of the hotel's private security that night, a symbolic reminder of Aiden's reach. Nothing about the arrangement was accidental. The guest list had been curated, the access points controlled, the service corridors monitored. On paper, the evening was airtight. The disruption came without warning. It did not begin with a shout or an alarm. It began with a shift in energy that Aiden felt before he consciously identified it. A ripple passed through the far side of the ballroom, the kind caused not by sound but by instinctive movement. A waiter froze mid-step. A donor turned too quickly. Then the illusion collapsed. Someone forced their way through a side entrance near the service corridor, their motion sharp and intentional, incompatible with panic or confusion. A flash of metal caught the light. The reaction was immediate and chaotic. Guests screamed and surged toward the main exits, overturning chairs and scattering glasses across the floor. Camera flashes erupted as reflexively as screams, instinctively recording what should never have been documented. Security closed in, bodies moving to intercept, to shield, to redirect. The ballroom filled with noise, a raw, uncontrolled sound that replaced the careful murmurs of negotiation. Aiden did not run. He moved back instinctively, positioning himself where he could see rather than be seen. His attention narrowed, filtering out the panic to focus on the breach itself. The individual with the weapon was intercepted within seconds, tackled and restrained before a shot could be fired. It was over too quickly to be an assassination attempt executed with confidence, too sloppy to be a statement. The real anomaly lay elsewhere. In the middle of the chaos, Aiden noticed her. She was not screaming, not pushing toward the exits, not frozen in shock. She moved laterally, slipping through the space between fleeing guests and the perimeter of security response. Her posture was controlled, her steps deliberate. She avoided the brightest areas of the room, keeping to the edges where shadows gathered. When a camera swung in her direction, she adjusted her angle and vanished from the frame. She did not look back at the restrained attacker. Her focus was on timing, not outcome. For a brief moment, their eyes aligned across the room. There was no recognition in her expression, no fear, no urgency to escape for safety. There was only calculation. Then she turned and disappeared through a service door as seamlessly as if she belonged there. By the time order was restored, she was gone. Police arrived within minutes, sealing off entrances and escorting guests to designated areas. Statements were collected, phones confiscated, footage reviewed. The official narrative began forming almost immediately. An isolated incident, a disturbed individual, no real threat. The city representatives emphasized resilience. The donors reassured one another. The hotel staff worked to erase visible damage, restoring the room to something resembling composure. Aiden listened, nodded, complied when necessary. Internally, he dismantled the narrative piece by piece. The attacker had been a distraction, not a weapon. The real operation had occurred during the 30-second window when attention fractured and systems defaulted to emergency protocols. Someone had tested response times, blind spots, and human behavior under stress. And someone else had moved through the heart of the event without being recorded, identified, or stopped. That was not coincidence. Later that night, after the guests were dismissed and the police left behind an echo of authority, Aiden reviewed preliminary reports in a private suite overlooking the bay. His security chief confirmed what he already suspected. No clear footage of the woman existed. Cameras near the service corridors had been temporarily blinded by overlapping motion and automated prioritization errors. Access logs showed nothing unusual, which in itself was unusual. Whoever she was, she had not forced entry. She had belonged there, at least on paper. Aiden stood by the window, watching the fog drift across the dark water. The city beyond looked calm again, indifferent to the disturbance it had briefly hosted. He understood then that the night had not been about violence. It had been about information, about testing control, about sending a message without leaving fingerprints. Someone had entered his space, measured it, and left. And for the first time in years, Aiden Black felt the unmistakable sensation of being observed rather than observing. The game that had begun that night was not about a single contract or a rival union. It was about who understood fear well enough to weaponize it and who would be forced to react. He did not yet know her name, but he knew one thing with certainty. She would not disappear for long. The girl who did not disappear proved her existence long before Aiden Black saw her again in person. Only a few hours after the gala had ended, and the city had sealed the incident inside a neutral press release. One of his internal reports arrived with details that did not fit the official explanation. A car had been found in a secondary parking structure 2 blocks from the hotel, positioned in a blind zone between cameras that normally overlapped. The license plates were counterfeit, cleanly manufactured rather than hastily altered. Inside the vehicle, surfaces had been wiped with professional thoroughness, not the frantic cleaning of someone panicking, but the methodical erasure of someone trained to leave nothing behind. No personal items remained, no fingerprints, no fibers, only the faint chemical trace of industrial-grade solvent used sparingly and correctly. The conclusion was obvious to Aiden. Whoever had moved through the gala had not fled blindly into the night. She had exited on her own terms, completed a secondary phase of the operation, and disappeared exactly where she intended to. The attempt on his life, if it could even be called that, had never been the objective. It had been a test, and tests were always followed by evaluation. What unsettled him was not the competence. It was the restraint. By morning, the city resumed its rhythm. News outlets shifted attention, donors reassured shareholders, and the hotel reopened its doors as if nothing meaningful had occurred. Aiden returned to work without altering his routine, because altering routines signaled reaction. Reaction invited pressure. He reviewed contracts, attended briefings, and approved expansions with the same precision he always had. Outwardly, the night had passed. Internally, he recalibrated. The next appearance of the woman did not come through security alerts or intelligence channels. It came through bureaucracy, where the most dangerous movements were often hidden. A mid-level compliance firm that partnered with several charitable foundations tied to Blackridge Holdings submitted an updated staffing list. Among the new hires was a junior documentation specialist assigned to audit trails and donation compliance. Her name was Claire Winters. Aiden noticed the name only because his attention had narrowed in the aftermath of the gala. Ordinarily, such a detail would have been filtered out long before reaching his desk. But now, patterns mattered. The firm she joined had indirect access to multiple financial streams connected to the gala. Not controlling access, not executive authority, but proximity. The kind of position chosen by someone who did not need power, only visibility. He reviewed her file personally. The biography was flawless, perhaps too flawless. Midwest College with a focus on applied economics and data systems. Graduate coursework completed part-time while working in analytics for a logistics firm. No gaps in employment, no disciplinary records, no social media irregularities. The references were real, responsive, and consistent. The kind of background assembled carefully, not inherited organically. It did not scream fabrication, it whispered preparation. By the time Aiden first saw her again, he was already certain it was her. The encounter was unremarkable on the surface. A routine review meeting involving compliance, internal finance, and external auditors. She entered the room carrying a slim folder and a tablet, dressed in neutral tones that neither drew attention nor suggested submission. Her posture was precise, her movements economical. She did not scan the room in the way inexperienced professionals did, nor did she attempt to make herself smaller in the presence of executives. She simply took her seat and waited. When Aiden's gaze reached her, she did not flinch. There was no recognition in her expression, no visible acknowledgement of the night at the hotel. If she remembered him, she concealed it completely. If she did not, then the resemblance was a coincidence so improbable it bordered on insult. Her eyes held the same measured stillness he had seen in the chaos of the gala, the same absence of panic. This was not a woman who reacted instinctively. This was someone who chose responses deliberately. During the meeting, Claire Winters spoke only when necessary. When she did, her contributions were concise and exact. She identified minor inconsistencies in documentation without framing them as accusations. She asked questions that appeared procedural but redirected attention toward overlooked connections. Each intervention was subtle enough to pass as diligence, yet strategic enough to influence outcomes. She did not dominate the room. She guided it. Aiden observed without interruption. Over the following days, her presence began to register more frequently, not because she sought visibility, but because she positioned herself where relevance was unavoidable. Documents reached his desk already annotated in ways that saved time. Reports flagged risks competitors had not yet identified. In one instance, a potential liability tied to a rival security firm surfaced in a compliance memo that technically fell outside her responsibility. The information was accurate, timely, and valuable. It also shifted leverage. She never presented these findings directly to him. They arrived through systems, processes, and intermediaries, as if the organization itself had decided to be helpful. That was when Aiden understood her approach. She was not infiltrating his world by force. She was integrating herself into it until removal would cause disruption. A crude operator would have demanded access or attempted coercion. Claire Winters practiced something far more dangerous: indispensability. He could have ended it immediately. A single directive could have triggered a background investigation aggressive enough to fracture her constructed identity. Contracts could have been terminated, firms dissolved, access revoked. But Aiden did not issue the order. Eliminating a variable without understanding it created blind spots, and blind spots invited surprise. Instead, he let her stay. Observation became his chosen strategy. He mapped her movements through the organization, noting how she avoided redundant interactions and unnecessary exposure. She did not linger in social spaces. She did not cultivate allies overtly. Her influence expanded through competence rather than charm. Those who worked with her trusted her conclusions without realizing when that trust had formed. At times, their paths crossed in hallways or shared elevators. Their exchanges remained strictly professional, brief, and neutral. She never attempted to prolong interaction. She never sought his approval. It was as if she understood that attention itself could be a liability. What unsettled Aiden most was not her intelligence or her discipline. It was the emotional restraint underpinning both. People learned to control themselves to survive environments that punished weakness. That kind of control was forged, not taught. He began to suspect that whatever war had shaped her had not ended. Late one evening, reviewing a consolidated risk report that bore her quiet fingerprints, Aiden paused longer than necessary over a particular annotation. It identified a vulnerability in a competing consortium's expansion plan, something that would unravel weeks later if left unaddressed. She had not exaggerated it. She had not exploited it. She had merely illuminated it. It was an offering, not an attack. For the first time since the gala, Aiden felt a shift in the balance of curiosity. The question was no longer whether Claire Winters had targeted him deliberately. That much was clear. The real question was why she had chosen proximity over disappearance. Someone with her skill set could have vanished entirely after the night at the hotel. Instead, she had stepped closer. Aiden recognized the implication, with a clarity that left no room for comfort. She was not finished. And neither was he. Aiden's decision to look backward rather than outward changed the shape of the investigation. He had learned long ago that real threats rarely announced themselves in the present. They revealed their intent through patterns anchored years earlier, in moments when power had been exercised without witnesses. Claire Winters did not behave like someone improvising. She behaved like someone continuing a trajectory that had already been set. The first fracture appeared in the year marked in her resume as a neutral pause. The phrasing was deliberately vague, framed as a necessary interruption caused by family circumstances. On paper, it was unremarkable. In reality, that year contained too much silence. No tax records that aligned with her stated location. No educational enrollment. No corporate affiliation that survived independent verification beyond surface confirmation. It was not an absence of data, but an absence that had been curated. Aiden cross-referenced the dates against incidents that had required similar erasures. One case surfaced repeatedly as he refined the filters. A structural collapse in a mid-sized city in another state, one that had made national headlines before being quietly settled. An old warehouse conversion project had failed catastrophically, killing several people and injuring dozens. The official conclusion cited engineering negligence and material fatigue. The lawsuit that followed exposed a network of subcontractors, shell companies, and expedited permits. It also exposed something else before it was sealed: testimony from a witness who vanished before appearing in court. The witness's name did not match Claire Winters. Neither did the age listed in the preliminary filings, but the timing overlapped perfectly. The disappearance occurred within weeks of the collapse, and shortly before the case shifted from public scrutiny to private settlement. The records showed a legal intervention that suggested influence rather than coincidence. Someone had paid not just to end the trial, but to redirect it. Aiden examined the photographs attached to the archived reports. Surveillance stills captured during the investigation showed a woman present near the site days before the collapse, her face partially obscured, her posture unmistakably deliberate. The resolution was poor, the image degraded by compression and time, yet the resemblance lingered in ways that were difficult to dismiss. The height was similar. The build. The way she held her shoulders, squared but not tense. It was not proof. It was alignment. At the same time, his primary competitor began moving with renewed aggression. Grant Harper had never been subtle, but the recent escalation carried a different weight. Harper Union initiated legal challenges, delayed permits, and pressured city officials with a speed that suggested premeditation rather than reaction. The target was a redevelopment tender tied to a historic district, a strip of land whose value lay not in its present state, but in what it would become once rezoned and rebuilt. Blackridge Holdings had positioned itself carefully for months. Harper moved as if he already knew where the seams were weakest. The district itself had a long memory. Old buildings, protected facades, and preservation clauses that masked ownership arrangements older than the city's current administration. Aiden instructed his team to trace the land back beyond the most recent transactions, past the shell entities and municipal overlays. What emerged was a lineage that converged on a name he had not expected to see again. Winters. Decades earlier, a family-owned construction firm bearing that name had operated in the same district, specializing in restorations that balanced preservation with modern reinforcement. The firm had dissolved abruptly following allegations that never reached trial. Assets were seized, licenses revoked, and the name disappeared from registries within a year. The official reasons cited compliance failures. The unofficial narrative suggested something more deliberate, a removal executed through regulatory pressure rather than open accusation. Aiden recognized the pattern immediately. It was a method Harper favored: erode legitimacy, force collapse, acquire remnants quietly through intermediaries. Harper had done it before, refining the technique each time. The revelation reframed the present conflict entirely. The tender was not merely a business opportunity. It was a return to unfinished business. Claire's behavior began to align with the new context. Her contributions increasingly intersected with Harper Union's vulnerabilities. She surfaced discrepancies in contractor histories, highlighted conflicts of interest buried under layers of compliance language, and flagged financial structures that mirrored those used in the warehouse project years earlier. Each discovery was accurate, documented, and presented without commentary. She did not accuse. She exposed. Aiden noted that she never framed these findings as favors. She did not seek acknowledgement or leverage. The information flowed into the system as if it belonged there, forcing responses from those who preferred opacity. Harper Union's momentum slowed, not because of a single blow, but because the ground beneath it began to shift. The more Aiden observed, the clearer it became that Claire was not acting in service of Blackridge. She was using Blackridge as a platform. His organization provided access, legitimacy, and insulation. In return, she offered precision and insight. It was not a partnership, but it was not antagonism either. It was alignment of interest, temporary and conditional. He considered confronting her, pressing for explanation, demanding transparency. He rejected the impulse immediately. People driven by unfinished histories rarely responded to direct interrogation. They responded to pressure applied where it mattered. Instead, Aiden adjusted his strategy. He allowed certain initiatives to advance that he knew would provoke Harper into revealing more of his network. He delayed others, forcing Harper to commit resources prematurely. Each move created friction, and within that friction, traces emerged. Shell companies surfaced. Old associates resurfaced under new names. Financial conduits linked back to the same legal firms that had handled the settlement after the warehouse collapse. Claire noticed the shifts. Her focus sharpened. She began spending longer hours reviewing legacy documentation tied to the district, requesting archival access that most junior analysts would not think to pursue. She did not ask permission directly. She found procedural pathways that made refusal difficult without raising questions. Her methods suggested familiarity, not curiosity. Aiden understood then that she had walked this terrain before, metaphorically if not literally. The past was not an abstraction to her. It was a map. One evening, as the city lights bled into the water outside his office, Aiden reviewed a consolidated report that layered historical ownership with present-day bids. The pattern resolved into something unmistakable. Harper was not merely competing. He was completing an acquisition interrupted years earlier, one that had required the removal of an entire family from the board. Claire Winters was not collateral damage from that event. She was a surviving thread. The realization altered Aiden's perception of risk. Claire was not seeking protection, nor was she attempting to destabilize him. She was pursuing closure, and she was willing to dismantle structures to achieve it. Her restraint had never been hesitation. It had been patience. In the days that followed, their movements grew more synchronized without direct coordination. Aiden applied pressure where Claire had exposed weakness. Claire illuminated areas where pressure would yield results. Harper responded predictably, tightening his circle, making mistakes that revealed desperation rather than control. The past had begun to surface, not as memory, but as consequence. Aiden recognized the inflection point with clarity. Whatever had been taken from Claire had not been lost to time. It had been buried deliberately, and burial required maintenance. Harper had maintained it until he could reclaim the value. Claire had returned not to reclaim assets, but to reopen the ground. By the end of the chapter, Aiden did not yet know the full scope of her loss, but he understood its shape. She was not driven by ambition or revenge alone. She was driven by the need to finish something left unresolved, to impose an ending on a story that had been forcibly cut short. And for the first time since the gala, Aiden acknowledged the truth without reservation. Claire Winters was not a variable to be managed or a threat to be neutralized. She was a catalyst. Whatever emerged from the collision between her past and his present would change the balance of power in the city. And Aiden, having traced the line back far enough to see where it began, chose not to step aside. He chose to follow the trail with her, knowing that some paths only revealed their destination once it was already too late to turn back. The moment Harper understood that subtle pressure was no longer enough, the conflict shed its disguises. What had once been a contest of permits, contracts, and influence became an open hunt, conducted without concern for collateral damage. The first signs appeared almost simultaneously across different fronts, too coordinated to be coincidence. Regulatory agencies announced unscheduled audits of Blackridge subsidiaries. Long-settled charitable funds connected to Aiden's public projects were suddenly questioned, their past donations reframed as potential channels for misconduct. Anonymous tips reached federal offices, each carefully worded to suggest impropriety, without providing enough substance to be immediately dismissed. The press followed with obedient timing. Articles surfaced that did not accuse directly but implied patterns: rapid growth, unusual consolidation of security contracts, proximity to municipal decision-makers. The tone was cautious, professional, and therefore dangerous. Aiden recognized the tactic instantly. Harper was not trying to prove guilt. He was trying to exhaust him, to drown him in process until momentum stalled and allies grew nervous. Inside Blackridge, the atmosphere shifted. Executives who had once moved confidently began measuring their words. Legal teams worked in rotating shifts. Every document was double-checked, every communication filtered. Aiden remained publicly composed, attending meetings and events with the same controlled presence, but privately he recalibrated. This was no longer a defensive phase. Harper had declared escalation, and escalation demanded visibility. At the same time, pressure closed in on Claire from another direction. The first attempt was administrative. An inquiry questioned the authenticity of her credentials, citing discrepancies that were technically explainable, but designed to force her into prolonged review. The second attempt was personal. A name she had not used in years appeared briefly in a restricted database request, flagged and then withdrawn too quickly to be accidental. Someone was testing the perimeter of her erased identity. The third attempt crossed a line. One of the few remaining contacts from her earlier life failed to show up for a scheduled meeting. His phone went silent, then disconnected entirely. Within 24 hours, another intermediary was admitted to a hospital under circumstances that suggested intimidation rather than illness. A third contact declined further communication altogether, citing vague concerns about safety. Claire did not panic. Panic was a luxury she had lost years earlier, but she recognized the pattern with cold clarity. This was not about leverage. It was about erasure. Harper was dismantling the remnants of her network, severing the last threads that anchored her past to the present. He was preparing the ground for her disappearance, the kind that left no legal trace and no questions worth asking. Aiden saw the convergence immediately. Separate threats had aligned into a single strategy. Harper had decided that neutralizing Claire was as important as destabilizing Blackridge. That realization forced Aiden into a calculation he had avoided since the beginning. As long as Claire existed on the margins of his operations, she remained vulnerable. As long as she remained deniable, she could be removed quietly. He chose the opposite. Aiden made a move that startled both his allies and his enemies. He formally integrated Claire into Blackridge's core structure, elevating her role and placing her name on internal records that were subject to disclosure. He granted her access to sensitive documentation, not as a symbolic gesture, but as a legal anchor. Her presence became official, recorded, and therefore difficult to erase without consequence. Simultaneously, he expanded her security detail. The protection was subtle, embedded into routines rather than imposed as visible barriers. Routes changed without announcement. Surveillance adjusted dynamically. Anyone attempting to approach her encountered layers of deterrence they could not easily map. For Harper's people, the message was unmistakable. Claire Winters was no longer a peripheral asset. She was now under the same protective umbrella as Aiden Black himself. Any move against her would register as a direct act of aggression, one that could not be dismissed as collateral or miscommunication. The shift altered the balance of power, but it also introduced a new tension. Within the boundaries of that protection, Claire felt the familiar tightening of control. She had accepted risk her entire life in exchange for autonomy. Now autonomy was being traded for safety, even if the exchange was presented as necessity. She noticed the changes immediately. The way doors opened before she reached them. The way unfamiliar faces appeared at a distance and disappeared just as quickly. The way her access expanded while her freedom subtly narrowed. Every layer of security was also a layer of observation. Aiden understood the contradiction but did not resolve it. From his perspective, control was a tool, not a moral failing. He had built his empire by anticipating threats and enclosing them within systems he governed. Allowing Claire to remain exposed would have been negligent. Protecting her required integration, and integration required oversight. Their interactions shifted accordingly. Conversations became rarer but more charged. Silence stretched longer between them, weighted with unspoken resistance. Claire complied with new protocols without protest, but her compliance was precise rather than willing. She followed rules exactly as written, revealing their limits through obedience rather than defiance. Aiden recognized the behavior for what it was. She was not submitting. She was testing the structure, identifying where it flexed and where it did not. The realization sharpened his interest rather than diminishing it. He had dealt with fear, ambition, and loyalty countless times. This was different. Claire operated from a place where loss had already occurred, where survival was not the goal but the baseline. As Harper's attacks intensified, so did the stakes. One of Blackridge's charitable initiatives faced temporary suspension pending investigation. A municipal partner withdrew quietly, citing reputational concerns. Harper Union capitalized immediately, positioning itself as a stable alternative. The city watched, waiting to see who would falter first. Claire responded by accelerating her work. She traced financial conduits Harper believed buried, linking them to offshore entities that overlapped suspiciously with the same legal frameworks used in the warehouse collapse years earlier. She compiled timelines that exposed patterns of acquisition following regulatory pressure. Each finding was delivered with documentation airtight enough to withstand scrutiny. Aiden began deploying the information strategically, leaking pieces into channels Harper could not fully control. The effect was cumulative rather than explosive. Confidence eroded. Partners hesitated. Harper's own network began questioning the cost of loyalty. Through it all, the tension between Aiden and Claire intensified, taking on a form neither had planned. It was not intimacy in the conventional sense. It was recognition. Two individuals accustomed to bearing responsibility alone now operating within the same gravity well. Their proximity created friction, and friction generated heat. Neither framed it as trust. Trust implied vulnerability. What formed instead was alignment under pressure, a mutual acknowledgement that retreat was no longer an option. Each knew the other was dangerous, not because of unpredictability, but because of precision. By the end of the chapter, the hunt had fully revealed itself. Harper was no longer maneuvering in shadows. He was striking openly, accepting exposure as the price of dominance. Aiden stood at the center of the counterforce, absorbing impact and redirecting it. Claire remained the axis upon which the deeper conflict turned, both protected and constrained by the same system. The game had entered a phase where outcomes would be decided not by secrecy, but by endurance. And in that phase, alliances forged under pressure proved stronger than those born of convenience. The hunt was no longer about who could strike first. It was about who could remain standing when the noise finally stopped. Claire's choice to reveal the truth to Aiden did not happen in a dramatic burst. It happened the way her life had been forced to happen for years, quietly, deliberately, with every unnecessary emotion stripped away because emotion created openings. She had carried her past like a concealed blade, useful only if kept hidden, dangerous to everyone if drawn at the wrong time. But the pressure surrounding them had shifted from discomfort to threat. Harper's counterattacks were no longer probing. They were shaping the environment, tightening access, redirecting attention, and turning bureaucracy into a weapon. In that kind of climate, silence was no longer protection. It was a weakness someone else could exploit. She approached the truth the way she approached risk, by controlling the frame. She did not present herself as a victim, and she did not ask for pity. She rebuilt the story as a sequence of events that made sense even to someone who distrusted narratives. She began with land, because land was the original sin of most corporate wars and the cleanest motive for the kind of violence that never looked like violence. Years earlier, Her family had owned property that seemed ordinary to outsiders, the kind of acreage that appeared in county records as a dull line item. The real value had been invisible to anyone who did not know what would happen next. A future infrastructure corridor, a forthcoming redevelopment plan, a quiet agreement between city committees and private investors. The land was not merely land, it was leverage. Whoever controlled it could bend projects, influence zoning, and attach themselves to funding streams that multiplied quietly over decades. Her father had been approached in stages, never by a single obvious villain, never by someone who could be named and blamed. First came the consultations, then the offers, then the subtle warnings disguised as advice. The terms were framed as generous but structured to consume autonomy. Signing would have meant surrendering not only ownership, but control over the narrative of what the family had built. He refused, believing refusal would force a renegotiation. He believed the law existed for cases like his. The punishment did not arrive as a threat. It arrived as friction. Permits slowed. Inspections became frequent. Credit suddenly tightened. Partners became hesitant. Deals that had been stable for years began to unravel, each failure explained away as coincidence. No one touched them directly. The system did the work. Claire had learned later that this was the point. When harm appeared as a natural cascade, no single hand could be held responsible. Then came the incident that ended her family's world and began her own exile. A structure failed. It was presented as negligence, a tragic but explainable collapse. Reports leaned on technical language, materials, fatigue, human error, because technical language could bury intent. The case was processed efficiently. Insurance moved fast. Officials made the right statements. Media attention rose and fell. The public accepted what it was given, a disaster, not a decision. Claire survived only because she had not been there. That accident should have erased everything. Instead, it created a loose end. She understood, even at a young age, that surviving a tragedy did not make her lucky. It made her inconvenient. A living witness did not need to have seen the moment of impact. Her existence alone threatened the completeness of the story. She became a risk to people who valued clean endings. What followed was not a rescue, not the kind you told stories about. It was logistics. She was moved through safe places and unfamiliar rooms, guided by adults who never explained more than necessary. Names shifted. Records were smoothed. Her identity became something that could be edited because keeping her alive required making her difficult to find. Every change felt like a small death, a birthday that did not matter, a school she could not stay in, friends she could not keep. Grief was something she swallowed because grief attracted attention, and attention was how people disappeared. Over time, she learned the rules of her own survival. Do not attach. Do not display. Do not ask questions in the wrong order. She learned to observe before she spoke. She learned to read people by what they avoided rather than what they said. Most of all, she learned that the world was run less by visible force than by paperwork that moved money and erased accountability. That was how she became what she was when she stepped into Seattle, not someone chasing closure, but someone trained by circumstance to track mechanisms. She educated herself with a hunger that was not academic. She studied corporate shells, trust structures, municipal contracts, and the quiet ways influence traveled from boardrooms into public decisions. She learned that corruption did not always look like bribes. Sometimes it looked like timing. Sometimes it looked like a manager who retired too early and a replacement who signed too quickly. When she began to reconstruct her family's destruction, she did not look for one culprit. She looked for patterns. She followed names across filings and noticed which names never appeared directly but were always adjacent. A legal firm that specialized in restructuring, a consulting group that handled risk, a real estate vehicle that bought distressed assets at unnatural speed. Each connection was deniable in isolation. Together, they formed a lattice. Harper's direct signature was rarely present. It did not have to be. His influence lived in the architecture of decisions. He benefited from outcomes without appearing as their author, which was the only kind of power that lasted. By the time Claire was certain, she also understood the scale. Harper's world was built to absorb accusations and turn them into noise. He had attorneys who could smother questions, allies who could delay audits, and enough charitable polish to make any accusation seem vulgar. If she moved alone, she could only create ripples. Ripples did not drown men like Harper. They simply warned them. That was why Aiden mattered. She had not chosen him because he was gentle. She had chosen him because he was dangerous in the way systems respected. He did not need permission to act, and he did not need public approval to hold his ground. He understood leverage and timing. He understood that reputation was not morality, it was a weapon, and the person who shaped the narrative shaped the verdict long before any court did. Still, Claire also knew what Aiden was. He was not a hero. He was a predator with discipline, the kind that wore suits and smiled at cameras because cameras were part of the ecosystem. He had built his empire by understanding fear and managing it better than others. That was exactly why he could fight Harper, and it was exactly why revealing her truth to him carried risk. Power did not automatically equal safety. Sometimes power simply meant a stronger cage. Their alliance formed like an operation rather than a relationship. It began with roles. Claire focused on the past, on retrieving what had been buried. She pulled archived filings, cross-checked dates, mapped the sequence of transfers that followed her family's collapse. She sought out former employees whose careers had ended abruptly around the time of the accident, people who had been paid to forget and had spent years living with what they avoided. Some were frightened. Some were bitter. Some wanted to be absolved. Claire did not offer absolution. She offered a chance to put weight behind the truth. Aiden built the pressure in the present. He assessed Harper's current dependencies, which partners were nervous, which investors could be spooked, which agencies had enough distance to act without appearing compromised. He did not strike wildly. He made Harper spend resources defending multiple fronts. He made uncertainty expensive. He forced Harper's allies to question whether standing close was still profitable. Evidence accumulated in layers. Contracts that made no sense unless someone expected a collapse. Payments routed through intermediaries that served no purpose except concealment. Internal emails that used neutral language to discuss outcomes with too much certainty. And beneath everything, a logic that repeated. Resistance was punished, assets were transferred, narratives were cleaned. Harper did not respond by attacking the evidence directly. He responded by attacking the people. He went for the foundations that kept them stable. Claire's contacts began to vanish from reach. Meetings were canceled abruptly. A former employee who had agreed to talk suddenly changed their mind and left the city. The silence spreading around her felt familiar, like the early days after her family's fall, when everyone became careful overnight. Then Harper shifted his attention to Aiden's visible power. If Aiden could be forced to defend himself publicly, his ability to pursue Harper would weaken. The board of Blackridge became a battlefield. Motions appeared that looked procedural on the surface but carried the scent of sabotage. Regulators showed interest. Old files were reopened. Investigations were teased into existence not to convict, but to drain time and credibility. This was the turning point Claire feared the most. The moment her war began to cost someone else something tangible. Aiden absorbed the pressure with a controlled calm, but Claire noticed the tightening around him. More meetings, less sleep, a sharper edge in the way he listened, as if he was measuring every sentence for potential exposure. He did not blame her. That, more than anything, forced her to look at the situation without the comfort of fantasy. He could have pushed her to release everything immediately, to burn Harper down in one public fire. He could have demanded full commitment and accepted collateral damage as the price. He did not. He treated the strategy like an equation and left the final variable to her. And Claire faced the question she had avoided for years. Did she want revenge, or did she want justice? Revenge was clean in its simplicity. It promised an ending. It did not care who was caught in the fallout. Justice was slower, messier, and demanded restraint. It required precision, choosing what to expose, when to expose it, and how to keep the truth from becoming an explosion that destroyed everyone around it. Claire altered the plan. Instead of detonating everything, they isolated the pieces that directly implicated Harper in criminal conduct while limiting damage to those who had been coerced, threatened, or trapped in the machine. It meant additional work. It meant higher risk. It meant giving Harper time to counter. But it also meant Claire would not become the kind of person who destroyed lives casually just because her own had been ruined. When the first disclosures finally moved, they moved with intent. They landed in places where Harper's buffers were weakest and where denial would be hardest to maintain. The reaction was immediate in the only way that mattered. Allies began to distance themselves. Partners demanded explanations. Internal conflicts surfaced inside Harper's coalition. The perfect confidence he had worn began to fracture under the weight of too many people protecting themselves at once. Claire understood then that truth did not need spectacle to be powerful. It needed placement. By the end of that phase, she had not achieved a fairy tale victory, and she did not feel relief. What she felt was steadier and colder, control over her own story for the first time. The past had been weaponized against her for years. Now it was a weapon she could aim. And Aiden, who had entered her life as a calculated necessity, remained standing beside her not as a savior, but as a force that could keep the world from crushing her again, provided she never forgot that any alliance with power required constant awareness. The price of truth was not paid in tears or speeches. It was paid in discipline, in restraint, and in the decision to win without becoming the same kind of predator she was fighting. The end did not arrive as a spectacle. It unfolded with the precision of a mechanism finally completing its cycle, without applause and without the comfort of a clear emotional release. For Claire, the collapse of Harper's world felt less like victory and more like a long-delayed correction, the kind that restores balance but leaves the landscape stripped and exposed. For Aiden, it was the moment when power stopped being abstract and became personal in a way he could no longer ignore. The decisive shift came when the conflict crossed a line Harper could not control with influence or negotiation. The evidence assembled over months was no longer fragmented or deniable. It had been layered carefully, designed not to shock, but to withstand scrutiny. Financial trails aligned with timelines. Shell companies connected cleanly to real beneficiaries. Communications once hidden behind legal phrasing revealed intent when placed next to actions. The structure that had protected Harper for years became a liability, because too many people understood that the safest move was to step away before the collapse dragged them down. Federal involvement changed the geometry of the fight. Audits expanded, no longer constrained by local loyalties. Subpoenas arrived with deadlines that could not be delayed indefinitely. What Harper had always relied on, time, confusion, exhaustion, turned against him. Each attempt to slow the process only generated more attention. Each denial created a paper trail that contradicted itself under examination. His circle tightened, not in solidarity, but in quiet calculation, as advisors, partners, and intermediaries assessed the cost of loyalty. Claire watched this phase with a calm that surprised her. She had imagined satisfaction, perhaps even relief, when the truth finally gained institutional weight. Instead, she felt a controlled distance, as if her body understood before her mind that justice was administrative by nature. It did not roar. It recorded, verified, and proceeded. The system that had once been weaponized against her family now moved in the opposite direction, not out of empathy, but because it could no longer ignore its own rules. Harper attempted to escape the inevitable in the only way he knew how, by shifting blame and offering sacrifices. Names surfaced that Claire recognized from the edges of her investigation, people who had benefited without fully understanding the machinery they served. Some cooperated immediately. Others resisted until the pressure made resistance irrational. The image of a singular villain dissolved into a network of small, self-interested decisions, each one insignificant on its own, devastating in combination. This realization brought no comfort. It only reinforced how easily destruction could be normalized when responsibility was diluted. When the formal acknowledgement of her family's case arrived, it was delivered through language that felt almost sterile. Findings, conclusions, violations. For Claire, it marked the official end of a narrative that had defined her life for years. The state confirmed what she had always known, that her past had not been an accident, and that survival had been the result of deliberate concealment, not chance. The recognition carried weight, but it did not fill the absence left behind. There were no parents to inform, no home to return to in its original form. Vindication existed, but it stood alone, detached from restoration. Aidan experienced his own reckoning in parallel. The exposure of Harper's operations strengthened Blackridge in the short term, validating Aidan's decisions and reinforcing his reputation as someone who could withstand pressure. But the process stripped away any lingering belief that control equaled safety. He had seen how quickly influence could invert, how allies recalibrated their values under threat, and how close he had come to losing everything not through a single error, but through proximity to someone else's crimes. Power, he understood now, was not a shield. It was a target that demanded constant vigilance. In the aftermath, the city adjusted with practiced efficiency. Contracts were reassigned, boards restructured. Public statements emphasized continuity and responsibility. Life moved forward because it always did. For most people, the scandal became background noise within weeks. For Claire and Aidan, the silence that followed was heavier than the chaos that preceded it. Claire stood at a familiar threshold. Disappearance had always been her final option, the ultimate form of control when circumstances became hostile. She had the means to vanish again, to adopt another identity and step out of the narrative before it reshaped itself around her. The skills that had kept her alive remained intact. But this time, leaving would not be an act of survival. It would be a retreat from something she had not allowed herself to imagine before. What anchored her was not dependence, and not sentimentality. It was the absence of pressure. Aidan did not ask her to stay. He did not frame proximity as protection or obligation. He acknowledged her autonomy in a way that carried real weight, because it came from someone accustomed to directing outcomes. He made space for her within his world without attempting to define her place in it. That restraint, more than any promise, altered the balance between them. Their connection evolved without ceremony. It was shaped by shared awareness rather than overt declarations. Both understood the cost of intimacy when power was involved. Both recognized how easily closeness could become leverage. What formed between them was deliberate and contained, built on mutual recognition of strength rather than the illusion of rescue. Claire did not soften herself to fit beside him, and Aidan did not attempt to reduce her complexity for the sake of comfort. In private moments, when the external noise finally receded, Claire confronted the emptiness she had carried for so long. The pursuit that had structured her life was complete, and without it, she faced the quieter task of deciding who she would be without a singular enemy to define her direction. The answer did not come immediately. It emerged gradually, through routines that were not tactical, through choices made without an underlying strategy. Stability, she learned, required a different kind of courage. Aidan, too, recalibrated. He remained decisive, controlled, and formidable, but the experience left a visible mark on how he evaluated risk. He trusted fewer people, but trusted them more precisely. He dismantled parts of his operation that thrived on opacity, not out of moral awakening, but because he had seen how opacity could rot into liability. His authority did not diminish. It sharpened, stripped of unnecessary illusion. The silence that followed was not peaceful in a sentimental sense. It was charged with awareness. Both understood that survival did not guarantee serenity, and that strength did not exempt them from consequence. Yet within that silence existed a clarity neither had known before. The past no longer dictated every decision. The future was not a reaction, but an open field requiring intent. They stood within that space not as a triumphant couple, and not as wounded survivors clinging to each other, but as two individuals who had endured pressure without surrendering themselves to it. What connected them was not need, but choice. They chose proximity without possession, alliance without erasure, and intimacy that did not demand surrender. In the end, there was no public celebration, no moment that signaled closure to the outside world. The victory, if it could be called that, existed entirely in restraint, in the decision not to disappear, in the refusal to dominate or be dominated, in the quiet understanding that strength did not require noise, and that the people who remained standing after everything collapsed were not the loudest or the most ruthless, but those who had learned when to act and when to remain still. That silence became the space where both Claire and Aidan finally existed on their own terms, not defined by loss or ambition alone, but by a shared recognition of what it meant to endure and remain intact. Story written and directed for Dark Hearts Collection. Thank you for being part of this silence between storms. More stories soon.